In 1453, the Ottoman Empire did the impossible. Mehmed II, at just 21 years old, brought armies before Constantinople, the most heavily defended city in the Western world, and conquered it in 57 days. 1,000 years of walls, traditions, and imperial power collapsed in less than 2 months. Europe panicked. What could stop such a force? 4 years later, that same empire sent 70,000 soldiers to swallow Albania. This wasn't an army of explorers or a reconnaissance force. It was a crushing weight designed to end any resistance definitively. Experienced commanders, veteran troops, and logistics tested in campaigns that had brought down entire kingdoms. Against this colossus stood a single man with a handful of warriors in the Albanian mountains, and the Ottomans were destroyed. Not lightly defeated, destroyed. Between 15,000 and 30,000 soldiers killed. 24 banners captured the sacred symbols of military units that represented honor and power on a level that is hard to comprehend today. And then, the unthinkable. The Sultan who had conquered Constantinople was forced to sit down and sign a 5-year peace treaty with the man who refused to die. What was the secret weapon that did this? It wasn't superior technology. It wasn't higher walls or more powerful catapults. It wasn't allies arriving at the last minute. What destroyed an army of 70,000 men was something much more unsettling and much smarter. It was patience. 2 months of letting the enemy think they'd won, turning a retreat into a weapon. And a man who'd learned the Ottomans from the inside, who knew exactly how Mehmed's army thought, moved, and where it was vulnerable when it thought it had already won. Today you will understand what really happened on September 2nd, 1457. Because this battle wasn't just about Albania. It was about proving that the advance of the most powerful empire in the world could be stopped, not by force, but by something no army can defend against. This is the story of the Battle of Albulena, and here's what most people miss. The secret weapon that destroyed that army wasn't forged in the Albanian mountains. It was forged inside the Ottoman Empire itself, by the man who later used it to bring them down. Let me tell you about Gheorghe Castrioti. He was born around 1405, the son of an Albanian nobleman named Gheon Castrioti. He wasn't a peasant. He wasn't a man of the streets. He was of noble blood, raised to lead, with access to the political and military knowledge of his time. But at some point during his childhood, everything changed. Gheorghe's father, to keep his territory and his family safe, handed his sons over to the Ottoman Empire as hostages. It was a common practice at the time, a way to guarantee the loyalty of vassals, while simultaneously creating a new generation of administrators trained the Ottoman way. The sons of conquered or submissive nobles went to the Sultan's court where they were educated, trained, converted to Islam, and integrated into the empire. Gheorghe was between 10 and 15 years old when he was taken to the Ottoman court. Imagine the weight of that. You're torn from your family, your land, your language, your customs. You're pulled into a completely different world, the court of one of the most sophisticated empires on earth. You learn the Ottoman language, military tactics, how the Sultan's commanders think and organize, where they're strong and where they're exposed. Gheorghe was intelligent and capable. He rose through the ranks fast. They called him Iskander Beg Lord Alexander, in Turkish a reference to Alexander the Great. No accident. It was an acknowledgement of his military prowess. Skanderbeg, as the name became known in the West, was a respected Ottoman commander. He served the empire for nearly 2 decades. 2 whole decades. This isn't the story arc of a man counting the days until his escape. It's the arc of a man learning. Every battle, every camp, every command decision he observed, all of it was deposited into an account he didn't yet know he was going to cash out. Campaigns in Anatolia, in the Balkans, on different fronts of Ottoman expansionism. He learned strategy not in classrooms, but on the battlefield, under experienced commanders, against real enemies. He learned how the Ottomans set up camp, how they distributed troops, how they maintained morale, how they responded to the unexpected. And then, in November 1443, during a campaign in the Balkans, he did something extraordinary. He deserted. He didn't flee alone. He forged a letter with the Sultan's seal, freed Albanian prisoners in Ottoman custody, and returned to Albania with a small group of warriors. In a matter of weeks, He recaptured Kruja, the central Albanian fortress, and raised his family's flag, a double-headed black eagle on a red background. The exact same flag that Albania uses to this day. What Skanderbeg took from the Ottoman court wasn't gold or weaponry. It was something far more valuable: 2 decades of Ottoman military training. He knew the army's behavioral patterns. He knew how commanders rationalized victory, how they interpreted enemy movements, and where overconfidence turned into vulnerability. In every way that mattered, he was a product of the system he'd dismantle. In the years that followed, he led an Albanian resistance that frustrated Ottoman attempts to reconquer the region. He won battles against much larger forces using tactics we'd recognize today as asymmetric warfare: mobility, terrain, refusing to fight on the enemy's ground. Every victory was smaller than what was to come in 1457. But every victory was a piece of the same puzzle: a man using everything his enemy had taught him against that very enemy. And there's a detail that elevates this story to another level. One of the leaders of the invading force was Hamza Castrioti, Skanderbeg's nephew. Think about that. This isn't a distant, unknown enemy. It's family. Someone who grew up in the same world, with the same blood, same Albanian roots. And he's commanding the army that came to destroy everything Skanderbeg had built. How did Hamza end up there? The Ottomans were masters at using family as a tool. When nobles became a problem, they found relatives willing to collaborate or willing to be used as weapons. Hamza likely took their side for promises of power and status the Albanian resistance couldn't offer. It was a brilliant move from the Ottoman perspective. By putting Hamza Castrioti in command, the army arrived with a message: Skanderbeg's own bloodline is on our side. Resistance is futile. Even the hero's blood surrendered. There's more. The Ottomans thought using Hamza would outsmart Skanderbeg. Maybe he'd understand how his uncle thought, anticipate his movements, predict where he'd strike. That was one of the biggest illusions of the campaign. Here's what they missed. Knowing Skanderbeg's background was nothing like understanding his military training. Hamza might have known what kind of person his uncle was, but he had no idea what decades of Ottoman training combined with years of mountain warfare had made him into. And there's one more thing they didn't understand. For Skanderbeg, this was personal in a way strategy rarely allows. His nephew was on the other side. This didn't break him, but it sharpened something. The clarity of who you are, what you're fighting for, what's at stake when your enemy shares your blood. Legend has it that Skanderbeg never let personal emotion interfere with strategy. But knowing Hamza was on the other side certainly made victory more essential, and not just in military terms. Hamza will show up again in this story, and when he does, it will be in the way you least expect. Summer 1457 in Albania was brutal. 70,000 soldiers crossed the borders with one goal: crush the Albanian resistance once and for all. In the first few weeks, it looked like they'd win. You need to understand what this meant to Europe. In 1453, Constantinople fell. A 1,000-year barrier between the West and Ottoman expansion vanished in one summer. The fear wasn't abstract, it was existential. Which kingdom was next? What borders could actually hold? Albania became a symbol of hope for European observers. A small territory with limited resources frustrating Ottoman attacks. Skanderbeg got support from the Pope, Venice, Naples. Not because they were reliable allies, they weren't, but because Albania's survival proved the Ottoman advance wasn't inevitable. In 1457, that symbol was being crushed. 70,000 soldiers is not an abstract number. It's a force that can be in multiple places at once. It can lay siege to cities. It can cut off supply lines. It can advance from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the defender to make impossible decisions about where to concentrate their resistance. The Albanian forces under Skanderbeg were a fraction of that. Estimates vary, but even the most generous put the defensive force at 20,000 men or less, probably much less for the direct resistance phase. The Ottomans advanced like they were just checking off another item on Mehmed's list. Cities fell. Positions were lost. The Ottoman army devastated Albanian territory with the efficiency Mehmed II had built over years. To the European diplomats, the church leaders in Rome, the Venetian merchants watching the Adriatic one conclusion seemed certain. Albania was falling. And then Skanderbeg did something no one expected. He stopped fighting. The Albanian forces retreated into the mountains. No pitched battle, no negotiations. Skanderbeg simply vanished into terrain he knew better than any invader. To the Ottoman commanders, this seemed like confirmation of what they expected. The resistance had crumbled. The Albanian army scattered or fled to the mountains to starve. The campaign was over. For Skanderbeg, it was just beginning. The truth about what was happening in the Albanian mountains between July and August of 1457 was quite different. Skanderbeg wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He wasn't waiting for European allies who never showed up. He was executing a plan. And the plan depended on one thing above all else: that the Ottomans believed they had won. Complacency. Yeah, I know. You came for cavalry charges and epic battles, not psychology. But pay attention. This is the part that changes everything. When commanders think the campaign's over, behavior gets predictable. Logistics relax. Camps become permanent, less ready to move. Night watch drops. Surveillance becomes routine instead of sharp. Soldiers, after weeks of marching, start to relax. The adrenaline that keeps you sharp fades. Soldiers talk about going home instead of the next move. That's not weakness, it's biology. And Skanderbeg knew this better than any Ottoman general. He'd watched victorious Ottoman armies from the inside for 2 decades. That's when Skanderbeg's years in the Ottoman system became a lethal weapon. He wasn't just waiting for them to relax. He knew specifically how Ottoman armies organized themselves when they thought the campaign was over. He knew the camp patterns, the command structure, where their nighttime defenses were weakest. The Ottomans settled in the valley of Albulena Ujabarda in Albanian, meaning white water. The valley offered what any 70,000-man army needed: space, water, terrain for logistics. From a military standpoint, it was smart. From Skanderbeg's standpoint, it was the perfect choice. The Tumenishta hills flanked the camp, and anyone who knew that terrain, who'd mapped every rise and dip like an experienced guerrilla fighter, knew what that meant. While the Ottomans settled into Albulena with organized camps and predictable guard patterns, Skanderbeg was in the mountains doing what no defeated general does. He was planning the attack. It's not an exaggeration to call this a secret weapon. It is one. The weapon wasn't tangible. You couldn't see it, count it, or defend against it. It was the ability to create a mental state in your enemy and then exploit the vulnerabilities that state created. Every week of silence in the mountains was another week of Ottoman vulnerability deposited like interest into an account that Skanderbeg was about to withdraw from, all at once, in a single night. Put yourself in Skanderbeg's shoes, hidden in the mountains, watching the most powerful army in the world camp below, knowing his men wanted to fight, knowing Europe had written him off. What's going through his mind? Is it patience? Or surgical coldness most people never experience? Here's what happened next. Skanderbeg's plan for the night of September 2nd, 1457, was elegant and devastating. It would work perfectly or collapse at the first failure point. No middle ground. 3 columns, 3 directions of attack. One night. A 3-pronged attack against a much larger force seems backwards. Why divide your forces when you're already outnumbered? Why not concentrate on one weak point? Here's why. A camp of 70,000 responds predictably to a night attack. A camp that size isn't one unit when attacked at night. It's dozens of separate units with different commanders and readiness levels. When alarms sound, there's no single brain directing response. Dozens of commanders try to assess the chaos, figure out where the attack comes from, and what to do. If the attack comes from one direction, the chaos has a focus. The response can organize, even if slowly. If the attack comes from 3 directions at once, the command system gets overwhelmed with conflicting reports. Unit A attacked from the north. Unit B from the east. Unit C has no idea where the attack comes from. The senior commander gets 3 urgent reports at the same time, each demanding an immediate response. That's command collapse. In night combat, that's often more lethal than the actual attack. But Skanderbeg didn't stop there. One element triggered everything: noise. Before the main attack, sonic distractions would draw defenders' attention the wrong way. This wasn't random noise. It was precise noise in the right place to pull defenders away from the actual attack. The main attack point, the Tumenishta Hills flank, was no accident. Skanderbeg identified the weakest point in their defenses. The hills created a shadow zone where surveillance failed, Lines of sight got blocked by terrain, and a mobile force familiar with the land could approach without being detected. His years in the Ottoman system made all the difference. Skanderbeg wasn't guessing. He knew how Ottoman armies distributed their night watch. He knew which flanks got less attention when they thought the fight was over. He knew from watching the system from inside where their defenses were thinnest. Then there were the plan's tight dependencies. The noise had to hit at exactly the right moment. The three columns had to move in perfect coordination across hard terrain in the dark. No radio, no modern tools. Everything relied on timing estimates, trust in commanders, and training that let them execute complex plans even when things went wrong. And then there were the men. Albanian fighters who'd watched their land invaded, retreated for weeks, had families at risk. Keeping them focused and disciplined while executing a precision plan during the rush of combat. That was the real job. Skanderbeg did all of that, and on the night of September 2nd, the three columns began their descent from the mountains. The Ottoman camp at Albulena was sleeping. Not completely. Sentries at their posts, guards walking the perimeter with the routine of 6 weeks without threat. But there's a difference between the vigilance that keeps an army safe and the vigilance of an army that thinks it's won. The noise came first. History doesn't tell us exactly what noise or from where, but it tells us the effect. Defenders' attention went the wrong way. Guard commanders assessed the situation and concluded the threat was in one sector. Resources shifted, focus narrowed, and then the Tumanishta hills erupted. What Ottoman soldiers experienced wasn't orderly battle. It was chaos movement in the dark, Albanian battle cries, steel clashing, bodies falling, all at once from a direction that was supposed to be safe. Before any coordinated response could be organized, the second column struck the opposite flank. Now the camp was awake, not disciplined, chaotic. Thousands of men ripped from sleep by combat sounds from every direction. Even seasoned fighters need seconds to orient themselves when waking to an attack. Seconds that, under coordinated assault on hostile terrain, are fatal. The third column closed the trap. Not complete encirclement. Skanderbeg didn't have the numbers, but enough. A devastating blow coordinated enough to shatter the command structure, delivered by warriors who knew every inch of terrain. At the moment, surprise had maximum impact. The Ottoman command system collapsed in minutes. Units without orders did what panicked troops do. They reacted to what was in front of them instead of the bigger picture. Different parts of the camp made contradictory decisions, some trying to reorganize, others running toward what they thought was the main attack, others just fleeing the chaos into the dark valley. In daylight, in open ground, 70,000 can absorb confusion and recover. Space, visibility, and numbers let them survive losses. In a dark valley flanked by hills, the enemy controls. With the command destroyed from the start, none of that matters. The Ottomans couldn't use their 70,000 because they couldn't coordinate them in the dark when 3 simultaneous attacks destroyed their command structure. The ensuing battle was a massacre. Battle is the wrong word. It was the systematic destruction of a force that lost the ability to defend itself. Units that reorganized faced attackers who knew exactly where to move. Units that fled encountered terrain their pursuers owned. 24 standards were captured. For context, a standard wasn't just a flag, it was a unit's physical identity. Capturing it meant capturing its honor proof the force was destroyed, not just beaten. 24 captured in one battle was humiliation that echoed through the entire empire. When dawn broke, 70,000 soldiers weren't an army anymore. Between 15,000 and 30,000 were dead. The rest scattered on the run, or trying to gather the pieces of destroyed units. And Hamza Castrioti? The nephew who switched sides, who commanded part of the invading force against his uncle, was captured during the battle. History doesn't record what Skanderbeg said when he saw Hamza. What it does record, Hamza was kept prisoner. Not executed, captured, contained, living with the cost of his choices. Family as politics, family as betrayal, family as a weapon turning back on itself. But here's what matters about Hamza. By being captured by his uncle, he proved Skanderbeg right about everything. The terrain, Ottoman psychology, the exact timing, the cost of trading blood for power. The dawn of September 3, 1457, revealed something the Ottoman Empire hadn't felt in a long time. A defeat that wasn't about superior weapons, more allies, or a tactical flaw they could fix. It had been caused by one man who understood them better than they understood themselves. When the news reached Constantinople, Mehmed II faced a problem that wasn't just military. It was symbolic. In 1453, he'd done the impossible. He'd conquered the city that had resisted invaders for 1,000 years. He'd become Mehmed the Conqueror, a title that defined who he was and what his empire meant. The fall of Constantinople sent a message to every kingdom. The Ottoman advance was unstoppable. Now there was another message circulating through Europe. It wasn't unstoppable. The numbers were too real to dismiss as propaganda. 15,000 to 30,000 dead. 24 standards captured. The standards were especially hard to deny diplomatically. Victors held the physical proof. What Mehmed did next shows the real impact of this defeat. He sent emissaries. From those negotiations came a 5-year peace treaty. Think about what that meant politically. Mehmed didn't negotiate with weak vassals. He negotiated when forced to, when continuing the fight cost more than settling it. Signing a 5-year treaty with Albania meant admitting control of that territory couldn't be won at the price the battle had shown. In diplomatic language, the man in the mountains had won this round. For Europe, the effect was immediate and concrete. Since 1453, Western kingdoms had grown fatalistic. Constantinople fell. Serbia was subjugated. Bosnia was under pressure. The question wasn't whether the advance continued, just when and where. Albalena created a break in that narrative. The papacy, which had backed Skanderbeg with limited resources and big words, now had proof that real support combined with the right strategy worked. Venice reassessed Albania's value as a buffer. Kingdoms that had started planning for Ottoman victory instead of resistance now had proof resistance was possible and strategically viable. Skanderbeg lived until 1468, keeping the Albanian resistance alive the whole time. Albalena was his defining moment, his greatest victory, his most decisive win. The Ottoman Empire eventually took Albania, but not while he lived. In 1457, when it counted, an army that had conquered Constantinople was humiliated by a man who'd learned from them. 24 banners captured, tens of thousands dead. A peace treaty signed not by choice, but necessity. A sultan who dominated the Mediterranean signed a document admitting he couldn't stop one Albanian in the mountains. That's humiliation. That's exactly what happened. What happened on September 2nd, 1457, wasn't just a battle. It was proof of a principle. So, what is the real lesson of Albalena? It's not about medieval military tactics, though they're fascinating. It's not specifically about Albania or the Ottomans, though the history matters. It's about asymmetrical advantage when you're structurally weaker. Skanderbeg had a fraction of the enemy's troops. Less territory, fewer resources, unreliable allies. By any measure of military strength, he should have lost. In a conventional battle, he probably would have. But Skanderbeg wasn't competing where the enemy was strongest. He was competing in the dimension where they were most vulnerable psychology. He'd spent decades inside the Ottoman system. He knew how the army thought when it thought it had won. He knew overconfidence created specific vulnerabilities. And he controlled the variable that created that overconfidence: his own apparent defeat. The retreat of July-August 1457 wasn't weakness. It was the smartest way to create a specific mental state in your enemy when you're outnumbered. How many conflicts throughout history have followed this exact same pattern? The seemingly weaker side refuses to fight on the enemy's terms, lets the enemy believe they've won, and then strikes when and where the enemy least expects it. What makes 1457 unique isn't that Skanderbeg weaponized the illusion of defeat that's as old as war. What makes it unique is the scale, the patience, and the level of insider knowledge that made the plan almost inevitably successful. In one night, 2 months of patience became 15,000 to 30,000 dead, 24 banners, and a peace treaty. Skanderbeg's secret weapon wasn't a new catapult. It wasn't an unknown formation. It was patience turned into a weapon. It was understanding that sometimes the most aggressive move is to look like you've lost. Every 15th century kingdom looking at the Ottoman advance after Constantinople assumed the only answer to overwhelming force was more force. Skanderbeg proved different, more intelligence. intelligence on how your enemy thinks, where they get vulnerable when confident, the exact moment that vulnerability peaks. That's why Albalina is still relevant today, not as history, but as a demonstration of a principle that shows up in every asymmetrical conflict. Know your enemy better than they know themselves, and you beat them with a fraction of their resources. Skanderbeg learned this the hardest way, torn from his family in childhood to serve the system he'd later destroy. But he learned it, and on September 2nd, 1457, he made them pay. If you've made it this far, drop a comment letting me know what impressed you most about Skanderbeg's plan: the 2 months of patience, the 3-pronged attack, or the fact that his own Ottoman training is what made it all possible. And if you want to keep exploring the secret weapons that changed the course of history, subscribe to the channel. The next story is about an army that should have been wiped out, and the only reason it survived is so unlikely that most historians hesitate to explain how it was even possible.